So this is going towards my continued effort to debunk America. I hold strongly that the American Revolution was similar to Scotland getting a king, or what we see today in one degree or another of Australia's sovereignty. Most notably, that I think the most uh, really is the England. They in their development of nuclear weapons, they did test. They didn't test any nuclear weapons on or around their sovereign territory. They did test in, if I'm not mistaken, the Falkland Islands, which is a heavily disputed area in South America, and I believe that they fight so vehemently for it because of what will be discovered from the tests that they did there. They leased testing in Nevada, so they detonated nuclear weapons on American soil, and they also detonated nuclear weapons on Australia. The interesting thing about the Australian test is that this is to show you again. This is the power of this stuff. Is that the Australian government, the prime minister or president, whatever the hell they have, was not made aware of it. Neither was any member of the Australian military, and so there was a confusion figuring out what happened. And I don't know how many they tested. It was at somewhere 4 to 7, but still to that day, uh, because the Crown can't offer apologies, so to speak, much like what do you have? The president apologized for the Tuskegee experiments where they injected black men with syphilis and left them untreated, or like under Obama they apologized for the blaming Spain for the sinking of the Maine. Remember the Maine, which was a propagandist call, which was blown up by American forces in order to instigate the war, but that was an apology. But activities like that don't, those kind of apologies, they're only formal and they have no relevance whatsoever. Um, they don't, a monarchy can't even gesture those. So, but on that note, so, and on this, it also asserts that the founding fathers are actually double agents, spy. Well, I don't know what you want to call them, proxy, puppets, whatever. So we get the Revolutionary War, which first of all, even if you talk to right-wing extremists or people that are Tea Party kind of people, the Revolutionary War, one of the primary motivators had to do with the King of England was trying to outlaw colonial currencies in order to monopolize one single currency so as to make it easier to tax. So, with the war that they had against France and Napoleon, which actually cost them money, the little Revolutionary War, in my opinion, in my theory, was an imperial tactic of manufacturing a revolt in order to consolidate the colonial interests. So you have multiple colonies operating independently with very little activities amongst themselves and very self-sustaining. But that inhibits the effectiveness of rule from abroad. So, one way, this is just one way of remedying that and being able to extract, because the crown is all about extracting wealth. That's why the Bank of England is considered the central bank of the world. And England doesn't export anything because in and of itself it has nothing. Don't count Ireland and Scotland because they are not affiliated by choice. Um, they're basically Indian and Scotland are basically Indian reservations, but it's harder to see it like that because they're white. So the racial mixes it up. But so England, um, this is a common tactic. This is what they do. It's one of the ways that they controlled Africa in their colonies in Africa. Africa was actually prior to the construction of the United States. Africa, the colonies that England had in Africa, were run in the same construct that ended up becoming the United States, in states with governors, and they even allowed, at that time, they even allowed more local governors, but they always had some kind of imperial presence, English presence, and we're getting into that if you don't already know. So what I'm going to do in a little bit of this is I'm going to show the American myth on the founding of this country and the principles and with the founding fathers, what they were doing. So I want to start the war. 1776 is supposed to be whatever the day, the year of revolution, where we won our freedom. Constitution hadn't been enacted yet. So, but a couple of events happened. There were some rebellions that happened. In particular, I'm going to go with the Shays Rebellion, which was an Irishman, just to make. And I want to make a note too that in the beginning, the Irish played a very significant role in opposing what essentially the founding fathers represented. So I'm going to go over the Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, but it's I would think it's a sentimental, which is brutality, or an interesting note to observe that it was Irish that were the primary forces behind these rebellious pushes that were vehemently and viciously denounced and retaliated against by the founding fathers and their liberty principles and all that good stuff. So here's just some notes, a couple notes from encyclopediabritannica.com. Shays Rebellion, 1786 to 1787. One of the primary things that they did was that they closed courts, and they did this particularly to prevent foreclosures, and we see this in 2008, as well as debt processors. I would like to note in 2014, the number one state that has the highest debt collecting is Arizona. So Arizona is basically like a mini England in one sense. And we see that with its police and literally the most blatantly fascist state that we have. New York is right there too, because it doesn't even ask you to check your face. But at least in Arizona, we're probably more prone to recognize that. Check your papers, the closing off Hispanic, potentially immigrant neighborhoods with SWAT teams and helicopters, equipment provided by the military, donations, so as to go door to door and ask people for their immigration status. So they have the most debt collecting agencies, and they have the least exporting. They export the least amount of stuff. So the state, if the Shay Rebellion were to be something implemented today, the number one victim, the number one state to suffer would be Arizona, because if they didn't have the access to monopolizing off of federal debt, because all debt is federal because federal currency is used. That's something we're going to see here. So Shay's men at the height in one group at the height were about 1,200, maybe 13, maybe 1,500. At one point, 1,200 men attacked the federal arsenal at Springfield in January 1787. There was, in total, there were as many as 4,000 protesters, and state forces that were called out. At this time, they were militia, were 4,000. And the largest confrontation was about 1,500 rebels or protesters versus about 3,000 state militia. I just watched Gangs of New York, and there's an important line there where these guys are playing pool and they're talking about how they're going to deal with it. And one of the guys said, asked the politician that's trying to get all the votes all the time. He said, "What is that phrase that you use all the time?" He's like, "I can't recall right now, sir." He's like, "You can always pay half the poor to kill the other half." So the state militia at this time, the rise of these events, as you can see, were foreclosures and debt process. Who was the debt to? The country's just newly established. So it's broken away from the mother country or father country, whichever one you want to call it, in England, and it's a newly established country without even a constitution yet, and not without a bank. So these were all local. So who are these debts to, and these foreclosures? Who are they being foreclosed by? So these militiamen were drawn from the same crowd that were protesting, except what they were given in essence was debt protection and foreclosure protection. And this is how you pay the poor to kill the poor. The protesters called themselves regulators, owing to a 1760 group that was also anti-corruption. Now, taking it to 1760, we're going into the pre-Revolutionary War, so it was against England. So these protesters associated themselves with anti-Britain forces. Governors of several states, including Massachusetts, Rhode Island, formed the state militia and used brute force. Except for Massachusetts, allowed one protest and then made plans for afterwards. But the other states, such as Rhode Island, they immediately responded with brute force, firing guns and beating and mass arrests. The Massachusetts governor, Bowdoin, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Boudin, is an interesting little note. I got this one from Wikipedia. He held more than 3,000 pounds, not dollars, because there was no dollar, 3,000 pounds in Massachusetts. And so these rebels were threatening the value of his pound. In October 22, James Warren wrote to John Adams, quote, "We are now in a state of anarchy and confusion bordering on civil war." So it is an interesting point to note that the Revolutionary War just ended. It wasn't counted as a civil war, but it was a civil war. The English still speak of it as a civil war, essentially. But and this is just 1786. This is just 1 year before William Paley's work was published, in which Book 5 and chapters 1 through 6 deal with on the duty of submission to civil government, and he speaks very highly of the American experiment to see how it's going to work. Boudin, the governor of Massachusetts, and Boston elite were calling for, in publications, they were calling to vindicate the insulted dignity of government by any force necessary. Samuel Adams claimed that, quote unquote, British emissaries were instigating treason among commoners. He helped draw up the Riot Act and a resolution suspending habeas corpus in order to permit the government to keep people in jail without trial. Now, this is where legal precedent comes in. One, the Riot Act. I looked it up a little bit. I'm not going to get too much into it. But I was arrested in Long Beach protesting Prop 8 on 11/07/08. And the interesting thing about there is when I first got there, what blew my mind was that the Long Beach police, owing to what I found out looking into this Riot Act, because it says at that time they had to read the full act before they could open fire or start beating the crap out of everybody. So at Long Beach, what they had was a truck with a looping, "This is the Long Beach Police. We are declaring this an unlawful assembly. You are hereby ordered to disperse." And they said section something or whatever. "If you do not disperse, you may be force will be used, and you may be bitten by a dog, electrical control device, chemical agents, or receive great bodily injury." So this was a looping tape. They even played it when I went to court because I fought it all the way for it. Took like 8 months. I fought it. They had to. They read it. They had the the lieutenant commander of that night read it because the recorder didn't work. And then when they finally got the CD player didn't work, and when they got the CD player work and the PA system in the court, it was blaring. So it was very intimidating, and that was a very powerful thing because I had a jury, and I know that scared the shit out of the jury. But it goes back all the way back to this time, 1786, and not only this, but to show that the Riot Act still has force, that immediately upon establishing freedom, with the implementation of the Riot Act and the suspending of habeas corpus, that still stands to this day. And this is where you get cops have the authority to detain you for 48 or 72 hours now. And there's even with the National Defense Authorization Act, there's even unlimited detention allowed. So the notion that America was ever all this free shit, this shit was suspended on day one. Before the Constitution was ever established, the legal precedence that is still held throughout the ages is stuff like the Riot Act, and the police moved in, and the lieutenant, in my trial, the watch commander said that they had obtained information through social media, like Facebook, that protesters intended on shutting down bridges and everything like that, so they had to move in with brute force. Well, there was nowhere around bridges. There was nothing of the sort. And there was only about at the time when they came in with brute force, when they still had a permit to protest, the cops were able to supersede the permit to protest because they were doing the looping message and basically giving forewarning, abiding by the Riot Act, which in their mind is lawful, because the Constitution doesn't supersede this. Okay, Adams even got a policy implemented, a new legal distinction. Again, this is new, but this was new then, but this is now a standing, that rebellion in a republic, unlike a monarchy, is punishable by execution. So that's the advancement of the American system over the oppression of the crown. Jefferson from France, he spent 5 years in France as the ambassador there, loving it up. Buying wines and living a life of luxury. And what is this financial? Where does this national debt come from? Wrote to a friend. This is very interesting because right-wingers use this all the time. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. So, and I think what he means by patriots, people don't understand that, because it's at the death of what he's applying. If you reverse patriots and you look at these Irish people that are fighting for their livelihood, for the ability to survive in a status that is anything different than that of the oppression of a tyrant king, which all kings are of tyranny. It became a tyranny of a system because, again, the first election, white men weren't even allowed to pick the House of Representative people or the president. White men didn't get to vote for a presidential election in a president. They didn't vote they didn't win a president, elect a president. They just got to vote in a presidential election for the first time in 1824, because the founding fathers didn't trust them. So, in 1787, John Jay wrote Rule Disturbances. An inability of central government to fund troops in response made the inefficiency of the federal government become more and more manifest. So this is all calling for a more centralized federated government. Okay, Massachusetts. Okay, and when the Constitution was finally put together, no one thought Massachusetts was going to do it. Massachusetts ratified the Constitution by a mere vote of 187 to 168, led mostly by merchants, urban elite, and market town leaders who all owed financial allegiance to England, because that's where they got their money from, because America was broke. So the Constitution was in their financial interest, because the Constitution, as I assert, did not provide any benefits to the commoners, but it provided all financial interest by solidifying financial ties with mother country. I want to make a note too, get real quick into, I'm running out of time here, jump to the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 in Pennsylvania for the most part. This is out of encyclopedia.com. In 1791, to reduce the $54 million national debt. Who did they owe the money to? And what did they owe the money for? They say it was just for war, but you have Thomas Jefferson living up a life of luxury and is not on his own penny. You have ambassadors around the world. Okay, 54 million. It's to note the U.S. dollar. Each dollar then equates to $21.77 today, or roughly $25 in some estimates. So 54 million times 25. Okay, that was the national debt. Tax. Okay, the whiskey tax based on the still size, 400-gallon capacity, according to the government surveyor per year, was taxed 7 to 18 cents per gallon, depending on proof. And back then they didn't do this 80 proof crap because that was weak shit. They did high proof stuff. Small stills taxed at 10 cents per month or 7 cents per gallon, whichever was lower, and that equates to at least $2 to $3 per year. But the essential thing to note is that in Pennsylvania they didn't have any cash. They used whiskey. It was a complete barter system. So my assertion is that all of this was to impose, again, just like the beginning of the war, was to impose a single currency. In 1794, rebel forces of 5,000 numbered in 5,000. But in democracy, in a democratic state, that held no sway. They had to resort to violence in order to be heard. And when they were heard in October 94, Washington dispatched 15,000 troops because they were able, from the Shea Rebellion, they learned to fund them for one reason, to stop the rebels, led by Alexander Hamilton. One of the significance about Alexander Hamilton is that Alexander Hamilton was the first person, not the founder, but he was a student of a guy, I forgot what his name was already, but Alexander Hamilton was the one that was able to pass the first bank of the U.S., and he was a Secretary of Treasury, and he got the bank implemented, the charter signed from 1791 to 1811. The interesting thing about that first bank only supplied 20% of the currency, of all the currency used in the United States. The state banks accounted for the rest. So in my theory, the objective of these centralized banks are to acquire 100%, like the Federal Reserve Bank right now. This bank too was owned mostly by European interests because that's where the money was, because America was in debt. The Federal Reserve System is 95% owned by European interests, primarily England. Only 5% are owned by American interests. The Federal Reserve controls 100% by law, by fiat law, as well as fiat value. It controls 100% of except for coins. Interestingly enough, I must take that back. But in that is the essence of taxation. All goes with this. There's never been an America. It's always been an England. And the only function of America is to expedite the taxation capacity of England, from the primary source being the working class of America. So you have because the more U.S. money that's generated, the more U.S. debt is created. Because for every dollar that GE makes, every dollar in profit that GE makes is Federal Reserve money. Therefore, it is taxed. It's an interest-bearing note. So the reason they're preferred is because they make mass amounts of debt. And when they hoard their money for wealth, what that does is that prevents the circulation of currency, so as to perpetuate the establishment of more debt. And if the debt's estimated to be like something like 6 or 7% on every dollar bill, that doesn't mean that it's 6 cents. That means it's $1.06 of debt. It's just like when you get a home loan and they say, oh, the loan is only 3% or 6%, and then you pay 3 times as more. It's actually at 350%. That's the basic compound thing that's going on with the Federal Reserve. So, towards my main point on this again is I'm establishing that there's no such thing as America, and the only first step towards anything positive is destroying England and killing the crown and hanging the entire royal family and parliament. Peace out.